All right. Well, good morning. My name is Taylor. I'm the family's pastor, and I typically teach our Parent Connect class, which is where you are right now. And I am not there in person, at least in that room. I am currently co-teaching, co-preaching with Pastor Anson as we kick off a new sermon series called Spiritual Formation, How to Become More Like Jesus. Super excited about it. Hope you join us for that after the Parent Connect class. But because of that, I figured I would go ahead and do this kind of video teaching thing again. And we'll just dive in here. We're in the book of Ruth. So if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, go ahead and turn to the book of Ruth. This is one of my favorite stories in Scripture, one of my favorite books to look at. I just think it's a beautiful story. It's really like a short story. I love to read like short stories or collections of short stories or like novellas. And sometimes this book is classified as like a short story or a novella, if that's the way you pronounce it. I'm not sure. But just this short little story. It's got a plot movement. There's a problem that needs to be solved. And there's these characters with rich dialogue. And there's some interesting things going on throughout it. And so because of that, I just want us, as a short book, I want us to just treat the whole thing like a short story. And we're just going to read this whole book together as over the next 2 weeks. Rather than kind of picking apart verses here or there, pulling out one theme and focusing on it, I'm just going to dismiss us to our tables for 10 minutes or so to read a chapter, discuss at your table, and then we'll kind of come back to the video and I'll make my comments on the chapter, and then we'll go to the next one. And so we'll do that for 2 weeks. And that way we get to see the whole book in its beauty, because I do think we should look at this book from beginning to end and see the message that's there. Okay, sound good? Well, let's go ahead and do this. Go ahead, take 10 minutes, and read through the first chapter of Ruth at your table. And if you have time, read it twice. Ask really good questions. Don't be afraid to ask a dumb question. Try to focus on the main characters. You have 3 main characters throughout the book of Ruth: Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. So focus on them and how they're being characterized. And try to remember where we're at in the big story of Scripture, if you can. But go ahead, take 10 minutes, and then we'll come back here. All right, well, good morning. My name is Taylor. I'm the family's pastor, and I typically teach our Parent Connect class, which is where you are right now. And I just want us, as a short book, I want us to just treat the whole thing like a short story. And we're just going to dismiss us to our tables for 10 minutes to read a chapter, discuss at your table, and then we'll come back to the video and I'll make my comments on the chapter. And then we'll go to the next one. And so Okay, let's get into the story. Story of Ruth. During the time of the Judges, and this is from the book of Judges, which we talked about last week if you were here, focused on Gideon. We also talked about how Judges isn't probably the best name for it, but nonetheless, this is when all this chaos is happening in Israel, where they're in this cycle of apostasy and oppression. They're crying out, then God will send a deliverer, and there'll be a time of peace. But then they go back into these times of apostasy or leaving God or distrusting God, and they just spiral into becoming just like the Canaanites. That's what the whole book of Judges is about. So this is happening. This little short story is happening during that time. It's kind of framing it up for us. And there was a famine in the land. They didn't have food. And so a man left Bethlehem in Judah with his wife and 2 sons to stay in the territory of Moab for a while. And the man's name, the man who left, was Elimelech, which means God is my king. And his wife's name was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered into the fields of Moab and settled there. Now, don't know if this is good or bad. Should Elimelech have left Israel and gone to Moab, which was not part of Israel? It was a foreign land. It's right on the border. It's where the book of Deuteronomy mostly takes place. But was he supposed to do this? Was it a good thing or a virtuous thing? And I think we're supposed to see this more so as a negative thing. Maybe he's being faithful. He's not going back to Egypt at least, but maybe he's going to Moab. But there's some ambiguity there, whether this was good or bad, and it kind of gets teased out as we keep going. Naomi's husband, Elimelech, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. Her sons took Moabite women as their wives. It's not as clear to us, but this is a negative. Okay, this is not good. You could debate whether there's some ambiguity here, but I think one commentator made a really good case that as you look at this verb throughout the Hebrew Bible and foreign marriages in the Hebrew Bible, here, just the way it's phrased, it's a negative thing. They shouldn't have done this. But nonetheless, they did. And the Moabite women, one was named Orpah, and the second was named Ruth. After they lived in Moab about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. And the woman, this was Naomi, was left without her 2 children and without her husband. So Naomi here, she's experienced a lot of loss. She's not only lost her husband, but her 2 sons. And I just didn't draw this. I pulled this diagram from the Bible software I use. And so you had Elimelech. This is the guy who left and went to Moab during the famine. He took his wife, Naomi. That's his wife. And they had 2 sons, Chilion and Mahlon. They married some Moabite women. That'd be Ruth and Orpah. But throughout the story, Elimelech died, Chilion died, and Mahlon died. So you just have these 3 women here. That's who is kind of left. And this would be bad news for them. No male heir to carry on their name. This was a big problem in the ancient world. So this is a crisis. This is a crisis for Naomi and Ruth and Orpah. So let's continue here. She and her daughters-in-law set out to return from the territory of Moab because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people's need by providing them food. So Naomi hears about this. She hears this kind of good news that God is providing food for his people again. And so she wants to return back to her land. This is the Hebrew word shub or shub. However you want to pronounce it. Just pronounce it with confidence. This is actually where we get the translation for repentance. It's all about returning. And so what Naomi is doing is she's returning back to Israel. This is a good thing. She's turning back and going to her home. Now, it's because she heard there's food there, but nonetheless, she is returning. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her 2 daughters, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. And so now Naomi said to them, each of you, this is the 2, Orpah and Ruth, her daughters-in-law, each of you go back to your mother's home. And they're from Moab, right? May the Lord, Yahweh, Israel's God, show kindness to you as you have shown to the dead and to me. This is a key word. This is the Hebrew word hesed. I don't know. Hesed. And kindness is how it's often translated throughout this story. But it's one of those Hebrew words that we just don't have a one-to-one correlation to in English. Sometimes it's translated loving kindness. But it's one of those dense Hebrew words. It's got a strong relational term to it. That's like a cluster of concepts, really. All of like the positive attributes of God. Love, mercy, grace, kindness, goodness, benevolence, loyalty, covenant faithfulness. All of this is kind of packaged into this word, hesed. In short, it's the quality that moves a person to act for the benefit of another with respect to the advantage it might bring to the one who expresses it. So it's an action word. It's you care, you love, you show kindness, grace, but it's active faithfulness. So what Naomi is saying is, may the Lord show that to these Moabite women, these non-Israelite women, as they have shown it to her. So what Naomi is saying is that Ruth and Orpah, these non-Israelite women, have shown kindness, hesed, to her, and she wants the Lord to restore that on them as well. So it's a beautiful picture of Yahweh blessing foreign, non-Israelite nations. That's what Naomi wants for her. May the Lord grant each of you rest in the house of a new husband. She kissed them, and they wept loudly. Verse 10, they said to her, we insist on returning with you and your people. This is a remarkable statement. This is just remarkable that they would rather stay with Naomi, who they are only associated with by marriage, and forsake their own people, staying with their own people. That is unheard of, really, in kind of the ancient world. Like your household, your people were very important identity markers for you. So they are more attached to Naomi than to their own people. And so they say, no, Naomi, we're going to stay with you. But Naomi replied, return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me. Again, they wept loudly. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So some people point out that this is almost like Naomi's giving a rebuke to them. Now, she's making a case why they should not come with her. And there's some interesting, it's hard to tell the tone of this as we're reading it, but it's almost like a rebuke. But at the very least, she seems to be interested in their welfare. They're saying, Naomi's saying, if you come with me, you're probably not going to find another husband. And again, like widowhood and the loss of a husband in the ancient world, it often meant the loss of all economic support. And it was like a roadmap to inevitable alienation and just destitution. So it seems like she cares for them, and she's like, you won't find a life with me. You won't be able to be restored. And there's this other weird, ambiguous part about the Lord's hand has turned against me. She suffered a lot of loss, and you can sympathize with her perspective. But one commentator points out that this is a really troubling comment. We tend to idealize human characters in the Bible, but in the context here, this is a troubling comment. And so you can read it differently, but she seems to be attributing her hardships to Yahweh. And she's not taking into account all of the human causality in her hardship and things like that. So this is an interesting comment as well. We've got to continue, though. They wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So Orpah was like, okay, you make a good point, Naomi. I'm going to go back to my people. But Ruth clung to her, and this is the same word for like marriage in Genesis 2:24, about a man clings to his wife, debak. A man will cling to his wife. So Ruth is really clinging on to Naomi here. But Naomi tries again. She says, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to your people and to her gods. Follow your sister-in-law. But Ruth replied, don't plead with me to abandon you or to return and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you live, I will live. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. And there I will be buried. May the Lord punish me, and do so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. Just a beautiful speech from Ruth. Her virtue, her commitment, her desire to be loyal to Naomi is just evident. It's a bit overwhelming, just the beauty of it here as you're reading the story. And again, there's some weird things with Naomi where she talks about how Orpah's going back to her gods. It's an odd thing for an Israelite worshiper to say, to admit. Maybe she's just talking about the reality of it, but maybe there's some troubling theological perspectives there from Naomi. And then you have Ruth, this non-Israelite, who wants to be identified with the God of Israel so that it becomes her God. We have to continue here. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped talking to her. Is Naomi being mean? Is she just kind of done with her? Is she irritated? Is she frustrated? Some commentators make that claim, that if you really read into this, it's almost as if Naomi is irritated. Like her silence is like a resentment towards Ruth. Maybe not. But nonetheless, Ruth is determined, and Naomi sees that. So the two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. That's where the story began, if you remember that. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women explained, "Can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara." This comes from the Hebrew word marar, which means to be bitter. She answered, "For the Almighty has made me very bitter." So notice we're going to read here. And there's kind of like four charges against God that Naomi is going to link to her bitterness and why she's bitter. She says, "For the Almighty," that's Shaddai, another name for God, "has made me very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord, Yahweh, has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord, Yahweh, has opposed me, and the Almighty, Shaddai, has afflicted me?" So kind of four charges against God that Naomi is bringing up here to her people. And it seems like that's not, you have sympathy for her. She experienced a lot of loss, but she's laying some heavy charges at God's involvement in those things. And you wonder if that's good. It's a little ambiguous. So Naomi came back from the territory of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth, the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So there you go. You have kind of the end of the story. And this kind of summarizes it and sets up chapter 2. So a lot of interesting things here that get set up. And just like a good short story, you got to keep reading. So take another 10 minutes, read Ruth chapter 2, and we'll continue on from there. Okay, 10 minutes. That chapter, we're just going to go ahead and walk through it ourselves here. Verses 1 and 2. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side. He was a prominent man of noble character from Elimelech's family. And his name was Boaz. Ruth, the Moabitess, asked Naomi, "Will you let me go into the fields and gather fallen grain behind someone with whom I find favor?" Naomi answered, "Go ahead, my daughter." So this is kind of setting up the story, right? The narrator introduces the character of Boaz and then kind of returns to the events here in verse 2. And so what we learn about Boaz He was a prominent man and he was a relative. Those are two key things about who he is, and this will be important as we continue on. And this prominent, this word might also mean kind of, wait, here. This noble character, it's like this righteousness. So I guess we actually see three things here. So we get this setup of Boaz, and then Ruth wants to go to the field to gather fallen grain. What is fallen grain all about? Well, this goes back to a command that God gave to the Israelites back in Leviticus 23. And actually, I have it pulled up here. I'll read it. But he instructs, when you reap the harvest of your land, you are not to reap all the way to the edge of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the resident alien. I am the Lord your God. That's Leviticus 23:22. And so what God instructed his people to do is when they're harvesting, they weren't to just max out the harvest. They were to leave some margin. And those margins were specifically for the poor and the foreigner to come in and glean. And so what Ruth sees is an opportunity to go and collect some of this fallen grain. And she asks Naomi's permission, and Naomi says, yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. So Naomi lets her. Now, what we'll see later, and I'll just draw it out here, is this is a dangerous situation for a woman to be in alone. And what we see, just kind of back to the ambiguous character of Naomi, is Naomi's like, yeah, go ahead. I think there's a case that could be made that she knows Ruth is going into a dangerous situation. She doesn't say anything about it. Just kind of put that nugget there. We'll follow it back up as we continue. But it's just part of this complicated portrait of Naomi's character that I'm intrigued by. Maybe it's just me and I'm just intrigued by it. So sorry I'm subjecting you to this, but there's something vague about the character of Naomi and the ambiguous motives that she has. Maybe because she's representative of some Israelites. I don't know. I'm getting off on a rabbit trail about that, I guess. But let's continue. We'll read a big chunk here and then I'll go back and highlight some things. So she's going to the field. So Ruth left and entered the field to gather grain behind the harvester. She just happened. It's like this, that wasn't, I just totally covered up the word. But it's this idea of like luck. Like, oh, it just so happened that Ruth was in the field of Boaz. As if this is some princess fairy tale story that's beginning. As we'll see later, luck isn't what's determining the situation here. But she just so happens to be in the field of Boaz, who was from Elimelech's family. Later, when Boaz arrived from Bethlehem, he said to harvesters, "The Lord be with you, Yahweh be with you. The Lord bless you," they replied. Boaz asked his servants who was in charge of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is this?" He sees, apparently, Ruth, takes notice of her. The servant answered, "She is the young Moabite woman who returned with Naomi from the territory of Moab." And, there's this emphasis on her being Moabite. It's like, you don't have to say she's a Moabite woman who returned from the territory of Moab. It seems to be kind of this redundant thing to emphasize that they're communicating to Boaz that she's a Moabite. She's a non-Israelite. And then they explain that she asked, "Will you let me gather fallen grain among the bundles behind the harvester?" She came and has been on her feet since early morning, except that she rested a little in the shelter. Been on her feet since early morning, so I guess this is a picture of she's a hard worker or she's diligent. Who knows? Then Boaz said to Ruth, so he goes up to her, "Listen, my daughter, don't go and gather grain in another field, and don't leave this one, but stay here close to my female servants. See which field they are harvesting and follow them. Haven't I ordered the young men not to touch you?" This is part of the dangerous situation I mentioned there at the beginning. He's ordered the young men not to touch her, just to make sure that she's being protected here. "But when you are thirsty, go and drink from the jars the young men have filled. So she fell face down, bowed to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor with you, so that you notice me, although I am a foreigner?" Before we keep going, I just want to, go back to this whole idea of how lucky it is that Ruth stumbled into Boaz's field and found favor with him. And now all these series of events, it's like, wow, this is amazing. And I think what's really beautiful about the story of Ruth is that God is often in the background. He's usually in the background for most of the story. But this isn't to mean that God's not involved. This is anything, right? This is anything but mere coincidence or luck or just a happening. I think the writer of Ruth wants us to see that God is at work. God is at work. And oftentimes it's behind the scenes, but he's there and he's working. Even when we don't see it, God is at work. And if you just zoom back even more, you remember this was the time of the judges. Like, this was a time marked by chaos in Israel where they're disobedient and they're just kind of spiraling out of control. And this picture in Ruth just reminds us God is still working to build his kingdom on earth, because we're going to see with the whole Davidic line and stuff. God is still working to build his kingdom when everything around us looks like chaos. I think that's just a beautiful reminder from this little short story. If you remember what's going on in the background here, and you just have this almost ordinary picture of events happening that is working to provide Israel with a righteous king in David, as we'll later see. God is at work, even when everything around us looks like chaos. I think that's beautiful. So Boaz notices Ruth. He talks to her. She finds favor in her eyes. And this is a key verse here, verse 11. Because she's asked, why have I found favor? Why have I found favor with you? And Boaz says, everything you have done for your mother-in-law since your husband's death has been fully reported to me. How you left your father and mother and your native land, and how you came to a people you previously didn't know. So this is what Boaz is attracted to. This is what he notices. This is what he sees. Does this part remind you of anyone else? Any other character in the biblical story, maybe? Someone who left their father and mother in their native land and they came to a people they didn't know. This is really hearkening back to Genesis 12 and the person of Abraham. Abraham left his land, his people, to go and obey God. And so Boaz actually says that Ruth's actions are similar to Abraham, the father of Israelite faith. And so Boaz is valorizing or honoring Ruth as another Abraham who's ready to embark on a journey of faith and commitment. One commentator says you could even say that Ruth has even greater courage and devotion than Abraham, because Abraham, he left to seek a life of prosperity and of favor and a future of promise and blessing. But Ruth, she left everything and followed a poor, vulnerable widow. And so in one sense, Ruth is even greater than Abraham, and this is kind of being drawn out. And so Ruth's virtue is extremely notable here. And so that's why Boaz is showing her favor. And he says, may the Lord reward you for what you have done, and may you receive a full reward from the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. So the Lord God gives refuge. This is a picture throughout the Bible. He gives protective shade or wings to her. And she goes, my Lord, I have found favor with you, for you have comforted and encouraged your servant although I am not like one of your female servants. At mealtime, Boaz told her, "Come over here and have some bread and dip it in the vinegar sauce." So she sat beside the harvesters, and he offered her roasted grain. She ate and was satisfied and had some left over. When she got up to gather grain, Boaz ordered his young men, "Let her even gather grain among the bundles." So this is not even just the leftovers, but among the bundles. And don't humiliate her or touch her. Again, back to that whole, this could be dangerous for some women in this circumstance, and Boaz is protecting her. He's showing her hospitality and favor, but also protection. And he gives her water and food to drink. He gives her some bread, or food, and water. And this is significant. Not usually to us, but this is significant because of the history between Moabites and the Israelites. There was a lot of history between the Moabites and the Israelites. This is just one that kind of plays on this. But no Ammonite or Moabite may enter the Lord's assembly. This is back in Deuteronomy. None of their descendants, which would be, for example, Ruth, even to the 10th generation, maybe Ruth was the 11th, who knows, may ever enter the Lord's assembly. Why can't Moabites enter the Lord's assembly? This is because they did not meet you with food and water on the journey after you came out of Egypt. And because Balaam, son of Beor from Pethor, and Aram Naharaim was hired to curse you. So what we see is Boaz is extending food and water. There's like this point that's made, it's kind of like an aside to the story, where he's giving food and water to her specifically. And just if you were an Israelite, kind of knowing the background of the Moabite relationship with Israelites, you would kind of see here, Boaz is like reversing the script on the story and their historic relationship. He's reversing the script of their relationship. And there's more of that to come in this story. But you already see hints of it here. And again, he's pulling out the bundles and, yeah. So Ruth and her virtue towards Naomi is heard about and reported. And what does Boaz do? He returns with favor towards her. So Ruth gathered grain in the field until evening. She beat out what she had gathered, and it was about 26 quarts of barley. I don't know how much barley that is. Maybe someone would have a good idea. Anyway, close of the story. She picked up the grain and went into the town where her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. She brought out what she had left over from her meal and gave it to her. Her mother-in-law said to her, "Where did you gather barley today, and where did you work? May the Lord bless the man who noticed you." Ruth told her mother-in-law, whom she had worked with, and said, "The name of the man I work with today is Boaz." Then Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, "May the Lord bless him, because he has not abandoned his kindness." This is Hesed again. So Boaz is being described as having kindness, just like Ruth had showed it to Naomi, to the living or the dead. Naomi continued, "This man is a close relative. He is one of our family redeemers." We'll talk a little more about what it means to have a family redeemer and or a kinsman redeemer next week. But what I find odd here, okay, maybe Naomi's just remembering this man, but she hears about Boaz and she's like, "Oh yeah, he's a close relative. He's one of the family redeemers." In other words, she knows that Ruth could marry this man probably and be redeemed into her family. But Naomi did not give this information, it seems. And again, it's part of that weird, like, what is Naomi doing? Anyway, Ruth the Moabitess said, "He also told me, 'Stay with my young men until they have finished all of my harvest.'" So Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "My daughter, it is good for you to work with his female servants, so that nothing will happen to you in another field." And again, this goes back to what I said earlier. Naomi knows that these are dangerous situations. And she's like, oh, so he's going to protect you. That's good because it's pretty dangerous out there. So again, why didn't Naomi say that on the front end? I don't know. But anyway, conclusion, Ruth stayed close to Boaz's female servants and gathered grain until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished. And she lived with her mother-in-law. Okay. Now what I want you to do is just take a few minutes. How does this, so far, you're reading the story about an ancient Moabite woman, an Israelite widow. How does this relate to us today? How does it relate to us? What does it tell us about God? What does it tell us about his people? And then what does this have to do with me? Maybe just with those questions, have some good discussion around your table, and then I'll try and wrap us up here in a few. Okay, I'm going to give you three things that I've drawn out. These aren't the definitive ways this relates to us today. It's just three things I noticed. And if I had to preach a sermon on this, these would be 3 points I would use, because Baptist preachers use 3 points. They don't all start with the same letter, but they are 3 points. Anyway, the first thing I think we see, I've already talked about it, is God is at work even when we don't see it. God is at work even when there's chaos all around us and we don't really see him explicitly or dramatically working. God works in the ordinary events of conversations, the ordinary events of gathering grain in a field. And this is how his kingdom comes. It's not simply in dramatic ways. It's also in everyday ordinariness. And that's a beautiful reminder to us. It's also a challenging reminder for how we're called to bring God's presence to our everyday life. I think the book of Ruth shows us that God is at work even when we don't see it. Second thing, when God seems absent or when we can't see him, what we can do is practice loving kindness in the small things. That's what we see Ruth do. It's probably not a small thing that she left and went with Naomi. That's actually a pretty big thing. But she practiced loving kindness to her in this big move. And then Boaz, what we see is this small, ordinary act of favor towards a woman in the field is going to spark a huge chapter in God's story for the people of Israel. So when God seems absent, or even when we're just kind of going through our everyday life and maybe God isn't front of mind, what we're called to do day in and day out is practice loving kindness. Lastly, loving kindness is contagious and transformative. I think this is one of the beautiful things we see about Ruth, is that she showed some loving kindness to Naomi. And then as she goes on throughout her life and people hear of her loving kindness, people want to extend that same loving kindness to her. I think there's some wisdom in this whole idea that, you reap what you sow. Loving kindness and acts of love are contagious. And what we actually see is they're transformative. They change things. When we choose to love, we change the outcomes of things. And so love is this action, something we do. And by doing this, it changes us, it changes the people around us, and ultimately it can change the world. Again, I keep hinting at this, the end of Ruth, but what we see is Ruth and Boaz. This is a spoiler alert. Okay, we're violating the short story, but Ruth and Boaz, they get together and they have a baby, and that baby grows up and has more babies, and their great-grandchild is King David. That's really why the book of Ruth is where it is in the story, because it's setting up the lineage of David, one of the most important kings, the most important king for the people of Israel. And we know Jesus comes through that line and everything. So these little pictures of loving kindness in everyday life is setting up a world-changing person in not only David, but Jesus. And I think that's a compelling picture for us today. Our small acts of love and our big acts of love today can change the world. And we know that one big act of love did change the world. Jesus, in his self-sacrificial love for us and for God's name and God's glory, died on a cross for our errors and our brokenness. And then he was raised to newness of life, and he extends that new life to us in the gospel, the story of Jesus. But one picture of that story is that love changes the world. And I think Ruth is a good picture of it as well. Okay, so we'll finish out the book of Ruth next week. We'll look at chapters 3 and 4, and how this all wraps up. But I love this story. Maybe just go, if you have time this week, go and read the book a few times, so you can have the opportunity to come prepared to chat about a few things. Okay. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next week.